Welcome back to Random History. I'm your navigator as we explore the little-known events and people that make history such an amazing subject. The events I delve into are probably not ones you learned about in school. No, these are the ones that, when you do hear about them, you're likely to think they could not possibly be real. But they are. In a previous episode, I mentioned that the wife of Colonel Jesse Atwood was a distant relative of John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed. He was, by all accounts, a rather eccentric frontiersman that traveled through the Ohio and Indiana valleys, often depicted with a cooking pot for a hat, planting apple trees along the way. In our True Hero segment, we will hear about one of my generation's heroes, Neil Armstrong, an astronaut from both the Gemini and Apollo programs and the first man to walk on the moon. Without further delay, Random History presents the stories of Johnny Appleseed and Neil Armstrong. Johnny Appleseed is a name that evokes images of a kindly man wandering the American frontier, sowing apple seeds wherever he went, accompanied by animals, singing hymns, and wearing his cooking pot on his head. Although these images form part of the American folklore surrounding him, the real story of Johnny Appleseed, born John Chapman, is a testament to the ideals of early American settlers and the pioneer spirit. Today, we're going to delve into his life, his motivations, and his enduring legacy. John Chapman, the man behind the Johnny Appleseed moniker, was born on 26 September 1774 in Leominster, Massachusetts. His parents, Nathaniel and Elizabeth Chapman, were working-class people. John's early life was marked by struggle and hardship. His father, a Minuteman who had served in the American Revolutionary War, returned to a household devastated by his wife's death and the demands of caring for his children. From a young age, John Chapman showed a deep fascination with nature. His love for plants and the wilderness was cultivated in his youth and would later play a crucial role in his life's work. By the early 1800s, Chapman had begun his westward journey, moving from Massachusetts to the frontier lands of Ohio and Indiana. He was not just planting apple seeds. He was also engaged in the practice of establishing nurseries. This was a common practice among settlers who needed fruit trees for both food and cider production, which was essential for early American life, especially since clean drinking water was often very difficult to come by. Johnny Appleseed's image as a benevolent wanderer who freely gave away apple seeds is somewhat misleading. While Chapman was indeed a kind and generous man, his planting of apple trees was a more calculated and practical endeavor. As settlers moved westward, they needed to establish permanent homes to claim the land. According to law, planting an orchard was a key step towards securing a land grant. Chapman, recognizing the opportunity, planted nurseries in key locations throughout Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. He would then sell or trade saplings to settlers, ensuring both their survival and his own financial success. Chapman's apples were not primarily intended for eating. The varieties of apples he propagated were used primarily to make hard cider, a staple of the American diet in the early 19th century. Cider, in fact, was often safer to drink than much of the water available at the time and became a crucial part of settlers' lives. This fact underscores Chapman's keen understanding of the economic and social needs of the frontier. His nurseries were often well organized, fenced in to keep animals out, and left in the care of neighbors or local farmers while he continued his journey. Chapman was a shrewd businessman, and his success was built on his ability to balance practicality with his ideals. One of the most fascinating aspects of Chapman's life was his deep connection to Swedenborgianism, a Christian denomination based on the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century Swedish philosopher and mystic. Swedenborg's teachings emphasized living a life of charity, humility, and harmony with nature. Chapman embraced these beliefs wholeheartedly and incorporated them into every aspect of his life. He was known to carry Swedenborgian religious tracts, which he distributed along with his apple seeds. He would often preach to settlers, urging them to live in peace with the land and to embrace the simplicity of Swedenborg's spiritual teachings. His belief in nonviolence extended even to animals. Chapman was said to have refused to harm any creature, often sleeping in the open rather than disturbing an animal's habitat. Chapman's eccentricities, combined with his religious fervor, helped cement his legendary status. His simple dress, barefoot travels, and peculiar lifestyle, carrying a tin pot on his head, for example, helped shape the myth of Johnny Appleseed, the kindly and saint-like figure wandering the wilderness, spreading seeds and goodwill. Long before modern environmentalism took root, Chapman lived in a way that promoted sustainability and respect for the natural world. His deep respect for nature was not merely an outcome of his religious beliefs, but a reflection of his understanding of the land's importance to survival. He planted trees that would ensure the future prosperity of the settlers while also helping to maintain the natural ecosystem. Chapman's work in planting apple trees contributed significantly to the development of the American frontier. The apple trees he planted provided food security for settlers and contributed to the survival of families. Additionally, his orchard became landmarks in many communities, helping to establish the identities of early American towns. While many of the varieties of apples that Chapman planted were not palatable for eating, they were essential for producing cider, which was a staple of the frontier diet. Hard cider made from Chapman's apples was often safer to drink than water, which was frequently contaminated. In this way, Chapman's legacy is tied not only to the health of the settlers, but also to their culture. The apple became a symbol of self-reliance, community, and the American pioneering spirit. John Chapman died in 1845, reportedly of pneumonia, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. By this time, he was already a living legend. His death marked the beginning of his transformation from a historical figure into a folklore hero. Many of the stories that surround Johnny Appleseed today were embellished in the years following his death, thanks to both oral storytelling traditions and printed accounts. However, while the details of his life may have become mythologized, the core of Johnny Appleseed's legacy remains intact. He is remembered as a man who embodied the virtues of the American frontier: hard work, independence, a deep connection to the land, and a belief in the potential for growth and prosperity through perseverance. Johnny Appleseed's story has inspired countless Americans over the centuries. His apple trees, while many have disappeared, live on in American folklore as a reminder of the enduring power of nature and the simple yet profound impact one individual can have on the world. The transformation of John Chapman into Johnny Appleseed as a cultural icon began soon after his death. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Chapman's life was romanticized and mythologized, especially in literature and in children's books. Stories often portrayed him as a mystical figure, more folklore than man, walking barefoot across America's untamed wilderness, with animals following him. Perhaps the most influential portrayal of Johnny Appleseed in the 20th century came from Walt Disney. In 1948, Disney produced an animated short film about Johnny Appleseed as part of the Melody Time collection. The film depicted him as a humble and kind-hearted man spreading apple seeds out of pure goodwill, guided by a heavenly figure who encouraged him to plant trees for the benefit of others. While charming, the Disney version helps cement a somewhat inaccurate image of Johnny Appleseed as a simple, altruistic wanderer, rather than the thoughtful and strategic businessman that he was. Nonetheless, this portrayal, along with others in popular media, contributed to the image of Johnny Appleseed as an American folk hero. In many ways, Johnny Appleseed's story has transcended its historical roots, becoming a symbol of the American pioneer spirit, environmentalism, and a deep connection to the land. Johnny Appleseed's legacy continues to resonate, particularly in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Chapman is buried there and is celebrated as a hero of the American frontier. Every September, his birthday is celebrated with the Johnny Appleseed Festival, where the public is entertained by reenactments of frontier life, where they can purchase everything Apple, from apple butter to apple fritters. Fort Wayne also has a minor league baseball team that honors one of the many legends of Johnny Appleseed, that he would wear his cooking pot on his head as he traveled. They are called the Tin Caps, and their mascot is none other than Johnny himself. Johnny Appleseed, or John Chapman, was far more than a simple wandering folk hero he is often remembered as today. He was a businessman, a horticulturalist, a devout Swedenborgian, and an early environmentalist whose work not only contributed to the development of the American frontier, but also left a lasting legacy in the fields of agriculture and conservation. Though the myths surrounding him have grown over the years, the core of his story, a man devoted to planting, nature, and community, remains as powerful and relevant today as it was over 200 years ago. I was born in the late 60s, in the heart of the space race. NASA had kicked off the decade with a selection of 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7. After 6 missions, they moved on to the second phase of the space program, Project Gemini, and the selection of 9 additional astronauts, or the New 9 as they were called. From there, they transitioned to the third phase, the Apollo missions. After the very first American mission into space, President Kennedy challenged NASA to take us to the moon and back before the end of the decade. We were well on our way to accomplishing that goal when disaster struck. On 27 January 1967, a fire broke out during a test of the Apollo 1 capsule, killing all 3 astronauts inside. It took nearly 2 years before the next manned flight took place, Apollo 7. Finally, on 16 July 1969, Apollo 11 took off for its historic mission to land 2 men on the moon and bring them home. The crew of Apollo 11 was Neil Armstrong, the commander, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, and Michael Collins, the command module pilot. These men were true heroes. They risked their lives for all mankind. Although all 3 of the men deserve recognition for today's True Hero segment, however, we'll be hearing the story of Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong's career with NASA is a defining chapter in the history of space exploration. Born on 5 August 1930, Armstrong was an aeronautical engineer and test pilot before joining NASA's astronaut program. Selected as part of NASA's second astronaut group in 1962, he quickly became a key figure in the Gemini and then later the Apollo programs. His first space flight was Gemini 8 in 1966, where he and fellow astronaut David Scott completed the first successful docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit, the Gemini capsule that they were in and a target capsule called the GATV. However, the mission encountered technical difficulties when a thruster malfunctioned, causing the spacecraft to spin uncontrollably. Ground control and the astronauts assumed that the issue came from the unmanned craft to which they had docked. They were wrong. As soon as Armstrong released the GATV, the spinning dramatically increased to a rate of about 1 revolution per second. Kind of like when a figure skater pulls her arms in during a spin. They accelerate. To eliminate the spin and regain control of the spacecraft, Armstrong activated the re-entry control system and flew the stricken ship by hand. Armstrong's quick thinking and calm response may have saved the mission, bringing the spacecraft back under control, but it ended the mission 3 days early due to extra fuel consumed by the maneuver. It is Armstrong's role as mission commander of Apollo 11 for which he is best known. Along with Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, Armstrong and his crew launched from the Kennedy Space Center on 16 July 1969. Upon reaching the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the lunar module while Collins remained in lunar orbit. Armstrong famously became the first human to set foot on the lunar surface, uttering the immortal words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The success of Apollo 11 made Armstrong an international hero, and his achievement is considered one of the greatest in American history, not to mention human history. His humility and professionalism were as admired as his technical skill. Despite the enormous public attention following Apollo 11, Armstrong chose to avoid the spotlight, focusing instead on education and public service. He left NASA in 1971 to teach an aerospace engineering class at the University of Cincinnati, where he served as a professor for nearly a decade. Armstrong's contributions to NASA went well beyond Apollo 11. He participated in the investigation of the Apollo 1 fire and later served on the Rogers Commission, which investigated the Challenger disaster in 1986. His technical knowledge and experience as a test pilot were invaluable to these high-level reviews. Throughout his career, Armstrong's contribution to space exploration were recognized with numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Space Medal of Honor, and the Congressional Gold Medal. His alma mater, Purdue University, even named the Aerospace Engineering Building after Neil Armstrong. Though Armstrong passed away on 25 August 2012, his legacy continues to inspire generations of engineers, astronauts, and explorers. His contributions to the Gemini and Apollo programs, particularly as the first person to walk on the moon, remain among NASA's most significant achievements, solidifying his place in history as a pioneering figure in space exploration. This brings us to the end of episode 9. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I hope you'll continue listening to my future episodes. You can use the link in the podcast description to view the sources, transcripts, and even submit a request for stories you'd like to hear in upcoming episodes. Until next time, make some history of your own. Navigator out.